Good evening. Welcome to First Evangelical Lutheran Church. I'm Evan McClanahan. I'm the pastor of this congregation, and I'll be the moderator of tonight's debate as well. Really want to thank you for coming out tonight. If you are a student of Professor Deer, say, I'm here. Yeah. All right. I was worried there for a second. There we go. Yeah. Okay, if you're a student of Professor Frisk, say, I'm here. Yeah. Wow.
Extra credit.
I'm gonna take it as a given that just because your professor is speaking, you're not automatically going to take his side. But as a Christian, I guess I hope that you do. But anyway, okay. The First Word debate series is an ongoing series of debates of theological, moral, and social issues. And if you would like to learn more about these events or be notified of them, there's an attendance card that we use for Sunday morning, but you can use it tonight and just put your email on that, and I'll just email you whenever we have events like this in the future. Tonight's debate looks at the question of God and the problem of evil. While many factors are often offered for the denial of God's existence, such as the lack of reliability of the scriptures, or contradictory claims of other faiths, or logical impossibilities, etc., the problem of evil is usually at the top of the list for most non-believers or unbelievers. Perhaps the most famous biblical scholar of our times cites this as the reason for his lack of belief. Bart Ehrman, a man who knows every word of the New Testament in Greek, wrote his book, God's Problem: How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer. He wrote that to explain why he lost his evangelical faith. In other words, he stopped being a Christian because of this problem, not because of any issues he's had with the Bible itself, even though he's made a career out of critiquing the Bible. Anyway, thank you again for being here tonight. It's an important conversation. The format for the debate is in your program already. 12-minute opening remarks, 8-minute and 4-minute rebuttals, cross-examination, and then 30 minutes for your questions. Which reminds me, in your program, there is a section with a dotted line where you can write down a question. You can tear that out, or you can just hand in your entire program. After the cross-examination, we will be collecting those questions. So if you have a question, fill that out. After the cross-examination, we'll pick those up, and then I'll be reading them from the table here. This is a formal debate. Has anyone ever attended a formal debate before? Okay, good. Several of you, good. So it's not like those presidential debates you see on TV where it's 30 minutes here, or 30 seconds here, 2 minutes here. We're actually going to take time to look at this issue in depth, and that means I'm going to ensure equal time for both participants. If you need to use the restroom, restrooms are basically behind me. You can go in this door or that door. There's a hallway back there, and the restrooms are there. Just make yourself at home and go as you need to. If you're hungry, I convinced the taco truck in our parking lot to be open tonight, and if you buy 2 tacos, you get a 3rd for free. So yeah, okay. So feel free, the doors are going to stay open, so feel free to go and come as needed. Please silence your phones so our speakers are uninterrupted. Recording of this debate will be available on the Sin Boldly podcast and on YouTube as well, so check that out. There will be a reception afterwards if you didn't get enough tacos and you still need punch and cookies. It'll be in the building next door, so just walk around or walk through the bell tower to the building next door. Okay, I think that is all the announcements and introductions I have. So I want to thank you again for being here tonight, and please welcome for our first remarks, Professor Brian Deer.
No, that's not working. All right, well, thank you first of all for having me here. I very much appreciate the opportunity. And I would also like to thank Professor Frisk. You did almost entirely all of the work on this, which shows with your student turnout. So thank you as well for coming up with the idea and making it happen. To begin with, I suppose you could say that I'm taking a pretty big risk with my eternal soul if I am wrong by coming into a house of God and taking the stance that I'm going to be taking. I imagine if I do get up to heaven and the pearly gates, this act might be right up there at the top of my rap sheet. So, I want to be very clear about what I am arguing for. Is it? Okay. And I want to be clear about what I am not arguing for. So, I am not arguing for atheism. I do not believe that the problem of evil is a strong enough argument to claim atheism. I do, however, believe that the problem of evil is a strong enough argument to go against the triple O conception of God. Now, what the triple O conception of God is, we'll get into in just a couple minutes here. Well, a few seconds. But first of all, I want to cover one of the particular arguments that tends to come up that is very dubious, if not all-out fallacious, is the argument of faith. Simply saying that you don't know what the answer is, but you have faith that there is an answer, is not an answer to the problem of evil. It is not a solid rejoinder. So just be very cautious of that. I know that a lot of times you can jump to conclusions internally, so just beware of that one. Okay. So here's the formal declaration of the debate that we have. Because evil and suffering exist, no existent God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So for those of you who don't know what that is, that means all good, all powerful, and all-knowing. There are many solutions that have been proposed for the problem of evil. I'm going to go over a couple of them and point out some of the flaws with them. But every solution that I've seen seems to fail. It doesn't quite get there. What usually ends up happening is that there's a redefinition of our terms. The goalpost is moved slightly. So the first one that I want to go over is the idea of a different kind of good. A lot of times, people will try to rejoin this issue and try to solve it by saying that God has an entirely different kind of good. Well, I don't see how that is a reasonable argument, because how would it be possible for us to be expected to accomplish the good without the ability of knowing it, or at least partially knowing it? Another one is that of having a bigger plan, that everything will work out in the end, everything is all for the best. And this seems to me to be a sort of Panglossian view of the world. Okay. One of the other arguments that's commonly brought up is that of soul building. So I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about soul building, because it seems to be one of the most compelling ones that people believe in. And that's the idea that the sweet is not as sweet without the bitter, so to speak. That in order for us to truly achieve greatness, we must go through trials and tribulations. And that would be fine, because there are many ways of going through trials and tribulations without needless suffering and without evil in the world. Yet evil and suffering are clearly inexistent in the world. So, there are two main arguments that I'm going to pose against it right here. And the first one is derived from the definition of good. So Nietzsche defined good as a positive thing, meaning that it was something that you would have to actually do. And bad would not be a positive action, it would simply be that lack of positive action. So, with a lack of action being a bad thing, and an active action, a positive action, being that which is good, I've lost my train of thought here just for a second, I apologize. We have to think of what types of actions we think of as moral, as morally reprehensible and as morally praiseworthy, morally blameworthy, and so on. Is it reasonable to ask someone to do something which is completely outside of their capability and outside of their reach? Now, I would argue that the answer to that would be obviously no. You can't ask a child to go fix your car engine. You wouldn't ask a surgeon to go fix an airplane. The other problem that we have here with morality is that inaction, when inaction is not taken, or when action is not taken and it could have prevented harm, that inaction is also morally blameworthy. That is a major problem. For instance, if you were standing next to a train and a train was coming and somebody was right there and you could do something to prevent them from being hit by the train, yet you did nothing, that would be morally blameworthy. So, in this situation, we have a God which, if capable of solving suffering, getting rid of evil, is not acting. That right there would be morally blameworthy, which I would argue would certainly lead to not being a completely good, omnibenevolent God. The second argument is that of free will. So free will is a big deal, and there are arguments as to whether or not we have it, but I don't think it would be a stretch to say that the God would have it, if there is a God, that the Christian God would certainly have the capacity to have free will. And in order to have free will, you have to have the ability to choose. Without the ability to choose, you do not have free will. So, if God has free will, then he must have the ability to choose evil and to choose suffering. And, I'm sorry, is it time? Okay, sorry. You must have the ability to choose evil, and if you can choose evil, then you must not be all good. Not completely, not 100%. Every single path that the theist seems to take to try to solve this problem of evil either fails or redefines the terms that we're using. So, I hope that at least my argument was slightly compelling to some of you, and that's all I have on that. So, thank you.
Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I have 12 minutes, so I'm going to jump straight into it. My goal tonight is not to simply convince you that the problem of evil is no problem for the theist. I think that goal is too modest and too weak for what we really want to discuss here tonight. I first will make a logical defense for the position of the theist, but I'm not content to restrain myself to a defensive position. I also want to go on the offensive to attack atheism because I think that it has critical problems and my worldview is actually more coherent than the atheist worldview. My second point will be to show that from the existence of evil, we can actually conclude to the existence of God. And finally, I will end with the existential problem of evil. Let me begin my first point by being a good philosopher and defining our terms. By the term God, we mean an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing being. This is the triple O God that Professor Deere talked about. We must specifically consider omnipotence because of its importance in rational discussion. If God can literally do anything at all, including contradictions, then God can be both evil and good simultaneously, and that would end the debate very quickly. God would be both blamed and not blamed at the same time, and this isn't really a God that we can even discuss. Instead, we need to understand God's omnipotence with a kind of sophistication that doesn't allow contradictions like this. Equally, we must understand God's omnibenevolence with sophistication. Certain goods are fantastic gifts and can be abused in fantastic ways. The most obvious is human choice. Through our human choice, we built great civilizations and we commit the greatest atrocities. The human will is both wondrous and disastrous. Philosopher Alvin Plantinga creates a logical solution to the problem of evil, commonly called the free will defense. This states that God's creations of persons with morally significant free will is something of tremendous value. God could not eliminate much of the evil and suffering in this world without thereby eliminating the greater good of having created persons with free will, with whom he could have relationships and who are able to love one another and do good deeds. Because God decided to create free agents, that is, persons, God cannot prevent evil. It is logically impossible for God to prevent evil while simultaneously creating free creatures. To create a free creature that cannot act freely is a logical contradiction. The creatures must be free to do evil, else they are not free at all. Therefore, God has reason to allow evil, namely human freedom. Plantinga's free will defense thus solves any purely logical discrepancy that may be presented to the theist. There's no purely logical means to assert the problem of evil, and so the atheist must make evidential claims as opposed to purely logical ones. What Plantinga does is demonstrate it is possible that God and evil coexist without conflict. He's proved that the existence of evil does not absolutely and necessarily eliminate the existence of God. The atheist claim here is really too big. It's nigh impossible to prove a negative. Plantinga can sneak through the atheist argument by staying humble and asserting the possibility for God to exist with and coexist with evil. But I'm not content with mere possibility. I also want to go on the offensive and attack my opponent's position. So Professor Deere talked about how he's not arguing for atheism, but that seems to be the only option for not theism. It's literally what the word means. Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica gives an argument for the existence of God that needs gradation. Let me explain what that is. When we speak of good and evil, we also think of better and worse. This is exactly the same as hotter and colder, more and less, brighter and darker. These are grades of qualities. In this case, grades of goodness and badness. This is what gradation is. So if there is more, then there must be most. This argument seems apt for the problem of evil because the accusation is that God must be best, omnibenevolent, but the existence of evil may contradict this. To be very concise, if we imagine moral value as a kind of scale, we must ask ourselves, what is the source of what we are weighing? Aquinas asserts that as soon as we admit to the existence of good and evil, we must assert a most good, that is the source of goodness, which is God. This is the triple O God as well. This is a God that is still simultaneously omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient. This argument can likely run teleological as well. That is an argument from design or order that would say that if there's good and evil, then we have moral law, and if there's moral law, then there is a moral lawgiver. The atheist must here deny the existence of good and evil. As soon as they admit that good and evil is real, we get to an argument that proves God. And as soon as the atheist denies evil, they have lost a necessary premise to use the argument to assert atheism. In the argument given, we assume God for the purposes of trying to find a contradiction. Everything else must be true in order for the contradiction to hold. The logic would simplify to, if both God and evil, then contradiction. But God is an assumption, and evil does not exist in the atheist worldview, so the contradiction can't stay. My third and final point is the existential problem of evil. This is the part of the evil part of the problem that involves our emotions and our identity. This half of the problem is much more down to earth, much less heady than the other 2 points. The final section of the problem of evil is that it hurts. This is kind of obvious, but I think it's from this section that we actually get our drive to know what is true. Without the existential problem of evil, we are detached or alienated from what we are really discussing here tonight. Life is often total agony, and these are the exact scenarios we imagine God should come down and assist us. This is the shake your fist at God part of the problem of evil. Life is often grossly painful, and what do we really accomplish with our blood, sweat, and tears? This is the part where we ask, is life really worth living? Let me use a novel as a backdrop for this. Brothers Karamazov is a Russian novel by Fyodor Dostoevsky, focusing on the lives of the Karamazov family. Ivan is an academic, 24, and very analytically minded. His brother Alyosha is the youngest of the family, 20 years old, and a monk in training for the Russian Orthodox Church. They have a conversation concerning the problem of evil in a chapter entitled Rebellion. At one point, Ivan tells a story of a wealthy general who is fond of hunting. One day, a serf boy was playing and threw a rock and hurt the paw of the general's favorite hunting dog. When the general discovered it was the boy, he threw the boy in the dungeons for the night. At dawn, he took the boy out in the field, made the townspeople gather, and put the child's mother at the front of the crowd. He then had his servant strip the boy naked, and the boy was numb with terror, so he didn't even cry. The general then set the rest of the dogs upon him, tearing the boy's flesh apart before the eyes of his own mother. Ivan tells this story to Alyosha, and Alyosha's shock and horror. When I say the words murder and genocide, they don't even produce close to the kind of response that we can get with specific cases like this. Ivan believes God exists, but there is no sense in worshiping a God that allows evil like this. Ivan concludes he would never want to go to heaven, that he returns his ticket offered to him. Ivan doesn't care what reasons may exist. The sheer weight of living in a world where things like this happen is too much for Ivan to ever respect God again. Alyosha agrees with Ivan. He thinks the world is disgustingly evil, but Alyosha stays faithful to God nonetheless. And for what reason does Alyosha do this? He doesn't cite blind faith or self-perseverance. In fact, Alyosha makes no intellectual answer whatsoever. And Ivan's rejection is equally not intellectual. Ivan doesn't care what reasons may exist. God is absent, and the world is in terrible shape because of it. End of story. Nonetheless, we think Ivan's objection has got to have some sort of validity. What we should see here is that the problem of evil is not solely intellectual, but also existential or experiential. So what's my point? Let me cut straight to it. Evil exists. This is just a fact we're going to have to live with. It's odd then that the question we focus on is the existence of God. Here's a question I think is probably more important. How should we then live? Alyosha's immediate response is to try to relieve Ivan of his existential dread. Alyosha cares for Ivan, and when he's done caring for his brother, he leaves and he goes cares for other people. See, Alyosha is fully aware of the problem of evil, but uses it as motivation for loving his neighbors. He has found a purpose and responsibility in life through the problem of evil, and will use his own blood, sweat, and tears to stop suffering as he can. This other problem of evil is solved by feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, healing the sick, etc. Alyosha is motivated by hope for a better world than the one he sees now, and he acts to repair it. But I'm still on the offensive here. If Alyosha has hope, what does Ivan have? Ivan has despair, and this is part and parcel with the atheistic worldview. Meaninglessness must reign in atheism because objective meaning points to the existence of God, as I said in point 2. Ivan correctly infers there is no reason to relieve the sufferings of our neighbors. no reason to relieve our own sufferings, no reason to even continue living. Practically speaking, atheism embraces a reasonless life. But this violates the present objection concerning God. Unjustified, reasonless evil does contradict the triple O God, don't get me wrong. But with a God, the presence of evil is never reasonless. Analogies to this are quite powerful. Take, for instance, the existence of pain. Is pain actually bad? I would say no, pain is not bad. Now, this is really unintuitive, so follow me for a moment. What would someone's life be like if they had no pain receptors at all in their body? Would they have a great, fantastic, pleasure-filled life? In fact, there are a number of medical cases that incorporate this, and they all have disastrous results. There is a story of a kid with this disease. He inherited it genetically, and he broke a glass vase. And because now there's a sharp object, he needs to tell his parents that there's a sharp object. He mistakenly carries the glass shard to go tell his parents and knocks on their door. And when he does, he's damaging his hand by holding the shard and has no idea that it's going on. Pain is a good thing because it lets us know that something is wrong. Pain isn't bad, but it's whatever causing the pain that is bad. If we suffered for no reason, that would be a nightmare. And I think that would contradict the triple O God. But this simply isn't the case. Could you imagine that in Syria, ISIS bombs a hospital and nobody cares? We would think that everyone had finally gone insane. No, the fact that evil like this affects us is letting us know that something is dreadfully wrong with our world. This isn't bad, but is in fact good. Alyosha's response is then to wage war on evil, not God. And this seems a far more coherent answer. There is something very wrong with our world, and the fact that we know this leads us to right the wrongs around us, to cure the plague of malice and disaster. If it wasn't so dreadful, would we actually care about its damage? And the answer is no. No, we wouldn't. Just as children who can't feel pain don't even notice when they're damaging their own bodies. The problem of evil therefore points us towards hope and God. To admit that the problem is real begets two separate proofs. That evil exists at all proves an objective source of values, and the dread and suffering of evil actually leads us to hope and healing. To fail to admit to the problem is to be intentionally blind to the state of the world around us. In conclusion, the theist can stand with a logical foundation as we love our neighbor. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I have to get my notes in order here.
Go right ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I was planning.
I can. Gotcha. Do you want to do it from the lectern, Brian?
No, I'd prefer here.
Okay, sounds good.
Far more comfortable. Okay. Okay. So earlier, potential of a God being unbounded from logic, and that would be nonsense.
Correct.
Okay, we'll just leave it at that God then is bounded by logic. Okay. So if God is bounded by logic, some of those things that you were talking about seem to be completely illogical. For instance, that which is all good cannot have aspects of it that are bad. It simply can't be. Now, maybe we need to redefine our terms again and claim that good and bad can coexist in a all-encompassing of all different quality, something that contains all qualities. But when you define it as being all good, that negates the ability for there to be any bad. The free will argument that you made, again, that's one of the most compelling arguments for a solution for the problem of evil. But there are still quite a few problems with it. You made some claims that that all the suffering that comes about from humanity itself, derived from human actions. But that's simply not the case. There are many places where diseases and natural disasters occur where humanity had nothing to do with it. And you might bring up the fact that it's possible to avoid those things. But you can't avoid things that you're completely ignorant of. So I would say that is not necessarily an option to get out of the problem of evil, discussing free will. Okay. You also talked about the idea of gradations. This kind of gets back to my point about good and evil coming from the same place. That would mean that God, again, would not be all good, but would be both evil and good, the source of all things, which seems that maybe we need to redefine our terms a little bit, and maybe it wouldn't be a triple O God, but maybe something slightly different. The other concept that you discussed, again, was soul building. Talking about what you do in the face of adversity. Now, again, I still cannot see how that is a reasonable answer to the problem of evil. Because as you said, evil still exists. Triple O God is not compatible with that. If evil still exists, then there certainly must be something wrong with that conception. Unless you, again, want to redefine changing the conception again, which is certainly allowed, I suppose. Okay, thank you. One of the issues that you brought up was understanding objective good, an objective moral truth. Now, I do believe in objective moral truth, personally, and I do think there is a way to get at it, and I don't think it has to be created by a triple O God. I think that objective truth can be found, discovered, uncovered through research and through experience, through practice, through trial and error, essentially through the scientific method. For instance, when you have a society, societies build certain rules, and these rules of society change over time. The ethics of a society are created like spandrels, unintended consequences of certain rules and regulations, certain situations and circumstances that society is a part of. Therefore, their morals actually explode out of the circumstances and situations that they're in. Now, this does explain a little bit of moral relativism, which is a very popular idea of our time, but I am not a moral relativist. It's just very similar to that. This is more of an evolutionary ethic. So you said that pain is not suffering. Well, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but suffering certainly is suffering, and there is suffering in the world. And I don't see how we can avoid all forms of suffering. If free will really is the root of it, we should be able to avoid all of those instances. Okay. And that's pretty much all I have right there. I think I'm ready to see the rest of my time.
Yeah. Okay. So, in your opening, you're arguing an anti-triple O, not technically atheism. So, which was a nice curveball, and I had to edit my opening speech very quickly to try to incorporate that in there. Let me see. So you reject that there's a moral relativism where our goods are different than God's, that there is no bigger plan that we can try to appeal to in order to figure this out. So I do think that actually we might need to define what is good. So the last phrase that you gave me, or one of the last phrases you gave me, was that morals explodes out of cultures, and I can't figure out how that wouldn't devolve straight into relativism. If relativism is exactly that society is what determines your moral outlooks, And if it's morality exploding out of different societies, I would assume that we would get different moral codes, which is generally the argument against morality in the first place. But then wouldn't God have his own society, which his own moralities would come into? So I don't know if I would understand the difference between that quite yet. Between God's moralities and our moralities, and why you think they do need to be the same. So if they're the same, as you originally said, I'm going to point to an objective source of what is good. That it can't just be societies, because those are going to be relative. We're not going to get an actual discussion of what is, the only discussion we're going to get is what is good for me and what is good for God, and how they're not exactly the same kinds of suffering. If they're the same good, then what kind of good are we talking about, and what source would it be from? I think that logically, unless we're going to accept a reductio ad absurdum or an infinite regress, that suffering has to come, or sorry, good has to come from somewhere. Goodness has to be something. And so there is some source for what we mean by goodness. You critiqued my soul building as well. I'd like to hint that this is a weird form of soul building. It's not the traditional Hick version of soul building. Hick is a philosopher's name, by the way. I'm not dogging rednecks. So the Hick soul building is that we accept, or we have trials, and God is not done growing us, essentially, and that this is part of the creative process into making us into good people. The existential problem of evil doesn't necessarily grow you. Instead, the existential problem of evil is simply pointing you to where the world should be, and how it doesn't match with who we are at all. It contradicts our identity to have evil in the world. So the definition that I have of evil is pretty close to the definition of unjustified, which literally would mean reasonless. The other thing to note is that if evil is reasonlessness, then evil acts much more like a twisting or a privation or a hole rather than an actual thing. So instead of evil existing as such, it's more like there's a hole in the ground, and so there's not dirt. And that instead there should be dirt, and we say that there is some sort of moral lacking here. That evil is not a thing in and of itself. If it was a thing, God would have to create it, which would make God the source of both good and evil. Instead, I want to say that God is totally good, and that those good things that we are blessed with are then warped. That we take those things and we screw them up all on our own. The free will argument was also there. So this is going to be my solid logical foundation. And the fact that I have to limit God to something that can be constrained with logic. Ultimately, the phrase that I would use is that logic comes from God's own nature, so that logic actually isn't created, but it's from God. It literally is a godly attribute. So I would say that God can't contradict himself. And if he's going to make free creatures, he cannot prevent the evils that we do. If we're supposed to be free, then we have to be able to have both. We have to be able to choose evil, and God has to let us choose evil. And you also commented that the free will argument does not cover natural evil, and I assume we mean things like earthquakes and hurricanes or plague and all these things that human beings don't actually contribute to. So I have an interesting comment for that. Let me put thoughts together real quick. What we would think is that God should come down and stop those things, or that God should have created something that never has those things happen in the first place. That through God's omniscience, he should know better, and that we don't have a world that exists like this. The fact that we do the bulk of the evil, I think. I mean, that earthquakes happen fairly regularly, but I think human evil happens way faster than natural evil does. I think we still have to take the bulk of evil as part of free will, and that natural evil isn't so far answered in the free will argument. The way that I want to answer it is to ask why we think we would be deserving of God preventing natural evils while we are already so horrible ourselves. I don't think anyone actually gets a pass for this either. I think really everybody is not that great. I don't think that that even little bitty sins God thinks are little bitty. How do I put this? Not asking you, Pastor. If we are truly free, then we would be free to follow God or not follow God. And it seems fairly clear that by following God, we would get his blessings. And we have chosen to do without him. That seems to be something I can put on choice. And then the existence of earthquakes and hurricanes, I can still pin on the fact that we don't want God around us. That if God really were to come down and start helping us with earthquakes, he likely would want us to stop doing all sorts of things that we don't want him in our business for. We have to deal with it because we've already rebelled.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still kind of confused as to what you mean by, or how you would know a thing like that about the nature of what God would want in regards to natural disasters. But, so it kind of occurred to me that I should probably explain what a spandrel is. So whenever you're constructing a building and you have a flying buttress out the side, like in a Gothic cathedral, you design the buttress, you design the tower, you design the cathedral. The space in between is not designed, but it necessarily must follow in a very specific and organized way based on the design of those other things. So if you take morality and it's not relative, it's not just whatever, it's not anybody's choice. It is extremely determined by how a society is constructed, by the circumstances that they're in. All of those things play a major role in how their morality is constructed. It's not to say that it's just willy-nilly. It's definitely not that. It's very much a necessary result of circumstance and construction. To answer your question about how you can have a non-relative morality that changes from society to society. Now, I don't think that morality would necessarily come from a God if it's that type of a morality. If there would be one, certainly I don't think it would be the triple O kind. And I don't think that the circumstances would exist to create a coherent understanding of that. The circumstances would be whatever he would determine them to be. Therefore, morality would be constantly changing and fluctuating. I think that would be where the relativity would be a problem, not necessarily in our societies with our moral codes and understandings. Okay. Okay, so if God is extremely knowledgeable, perfectly knowledgeable, and he were to create humanity, then he would know that we would be making errors with our ability to choose. Our free will would inherently and automatically, necessarily lead to suffering, pain, evil, etc. So why would you go about creating that? It seems to me that if you were going to go about creating that, there must be a higher good than good itself. And that would be the ability to choose. In which case, we would need to redefine our God into not just
and all good, all knowing, all powerful. But all good would be subservient to free will. The ability to choose would be primary, not a secondary quality of God, but a primary quality that would be would be placed onto us if that was the situation. Otherwise, being completely good would preclude that as a possibility altogether. And I still want to get back to how you would know how God would act if he came here in regards to natural disasters. I don't see how the two would be related. The suffering caused by humanity and suffering caused by natural disasters. I don't see how those two issues would even come close to being related in the eyes of an ethical decision in any way. Thank you.
All right, so your explanation about where morality comes from was very valuable, thank you. So I just went over with my intro to philosophy students, the intro, not the ethics course, about synthetic a priori statements, which would be necessary and come from experience. Is that where you, sorry, I can't ask that, we're not in the cross-examination. Dang it. So that actually might make some sort of sense, but Kant also comes up with things that are synthetic a priori, like mathematics. And we think that we have to say, well, where does mathematics come from, and things like this as well. I don't think that simply by saying that it exists and I can explain it doesn't mean, or it means that we don't have to have a source for it. I think we still need a source. The source would be necessary, sure, I'll give you that. And we learn it from experience, sure, I'll give you that too. But that doesn't answer the existential question for it, of why does it exist in the first place. Okay, now I want to mention the pain and suffering. Yes, I was making a distinction between pain and suffering. I don't think pain and suffering are the same thing. Suffering would be pain without due cause. So then, does suffering exist? Yes, but I think the suffering that exists is from other people. That it's us that's giving evil out without due cause. I also think that God is suffering. I think that God is not exactly pleased what's going on down here, and it causes him pain. And it's wrong, and it's us that's doing it, but I think he has an invested interest. So the conception of good that we're operating with here is that it's not that God thinks that free will is superior to other goods or superior to other bads, but that both pain and free will are both goods, and when as we've misused our free will, we now experience plenty of pain. I don't think God is making us suffer. I think we've kind of chosen this as our own. All right, I'm done.
Okay, we're going to move into our cross-examination period. So each side will have 10 minutes to ask questions of the other. A reminder that these will be pointed, direct questions to the other person. So try to keep the questions relatively concise. And during your time of answering, you're not allowed to ask questions in return. So I'll police that if need be and inflict suffering upon you. This might be a time to think about questions that you want to ask. So probably not everyone has a program because there's more people here than I thought would be, which is great. So if you have a program and you're not going to ask a question, if you could maybe hold it up or pass it back or something like that until someone who wants one can get one. Just kind of silently move it around, and someone who wants one organically will find their way to that. Thank you. Appreciate it. And after the cross-examination, if one of our volunteers could pick up, we'll send them to the aisle and we'll have a volunteer pick up the questions. Okay, but you each have 10 minutes. Professor Deere, you go first, and I'll let you know of the time as we go.
Okay. So you said that you think that God would be upset that he's in pain and suffering with our abuse of free will.
Yes.
So I have a question here, and it's how would you know that?
Because there is one good, and it's the same good that God has that I understand. Not to say that I understand it fully, just that there's no relativism going on here. Okay. So if I think that something is good, then so I have to think that God thinks it's good.
Okay. I'm still having a very difficult time understanding how you could possibly know a thing like that. What would be the evidence for what is good versus what is bad?
I'm trying to word it so you don't catch me in a Euthyphro dilemma. So the evidence of what I think is good and bad ultimately is going to come down to virtue, to which virtues we ought to have and things like that. I think that the virtues are going to be governed by reason, and that certain kinds of action are going to find themselves to be irrational.
Okay. Okay. I'm still also slightly confused as how you can pass over needless suffering as far as natural disasters. How do you make the comparison? How do you connect actions performed by human beings that directly cause suffering and evil? How do you connect that with the suffering of the result of natural disasters uncaused by humanity?
Can you be more specific in your question?
Are you saying that God would simply allow horrible things to happen because he's upset with us?
No.
Okay.
You have to ask me another question if you want me to keep going.
Yeah, I know. Okay. So what then would be the cause of these natural disasters that create suffering?
The causes are natural. I think that's inferred in the fact that they're natural evils.
And nature was made by God.
Correct.
Therefore, God knew they were coming. They knew what was going to happen. They knew suffering was going to come about, and yet did nothing to stop them.
Correct.
Okay, so you could say, by not getting in the way, he has allowed them to happen.
Yes, I would absolutely say that.
Would you agree that not pulling someone away from a train when the train is coming would be morally reprehensible?
Not necessarily.
Under what circumstances? Not
If they told you, leave me alone, don't come near me, I have a court order against you, you would not go near the person.
Okay. Well, I will disagree with you on that part. I still would save them. But it seems to me that that would the situation that we would be in. But I want to get back to the free will issue. Mm-hmm. I still don't see if God created us knowing free will was there, then obviously free will had to be superior, or at least the highest good. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think I would.
Okay. So what good would you consider to be higher than free will?
I think I consider all the goods equal.
Okay. Well, that wasn't helpful at all. Well, I'm having a very difficult time here with this. I just am not, I'm still not understanding where your evidence is coming from for your understanding of God's knowledge, what you think he would be feeling or knowing. I'm just at a loss for words at that. I don't know how to...
If you ask me that question, I can try to answer it.
I have asked you.
Okay.
How do you know?
Okay, so I think that because I understand the same kinds of goods, I also that these are the goods that God is concerned with. I think one of the goods he's concerned with would be autonomy, and that he would then leave us alone if we really, really wanted him to leave us alone.
Is a prayer not a request to intercede on that?
I think it would be, yes.
Okay.
4 minutes.
Also, is that not an assumption that you're making? Just
Which statement in particular?
never mind. It's okay. I'm at 4 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Never mind. It's fine. Or I have 4 minutes left.
You have 4 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. You're making a large assertion, a large assumption about the nature of God. And I'm just curious as to where you're getting that information from.
The assertion concerning God's goodness.
No, not his goodness, but the types of goods that you have and the relationship that they have with God's. You're making an assertion that your goods are the same as God's goods. And I'm just wondering how you know that.
I mean, I think the easy way would be to say that relativism is inherently illogical. And just if it can't be relativism, then there's got to be some good, one good.
Okay, so certainly there can be a good that would be objective, that's reasonable. How do you know what it is?
I think I know what it is through reason, ultimately. And I think I become good through habit, which are the virtues.
Okay.
Reason, I also would say, is objective, which is why I can pull from this objective source and try to reason to it.
Yeah, I think that we might be at an impasse here. The evidence for your claim seems to be not as strong as my claims would be, so I don't have any further questions at this point. I can't really go any further.
They're there. Okay, now that I can ask questions, I want to go deeper into the why God would stay out of our business. So, are you familiar with the Princess and the Pea by Hans Christian Andersen?
No.
Okay, so it's a cute little kid story that's about a prince who's having a hard time finding a wife, and this princess, supposed princess, gets caught in a rainstorm and has to sleep over. So mom gives her 20 mattresses and puts a pea underneath the bottom mattress, so that when the princess is sleeping, if she's a real princess, she'll notice the pea, and then he can find a princessy enough princess to marry, something like that, right? So, end of the story, the princess does notice the pea. She claims that she was bruised through the night, and they get married and live happily ever after.
Sounds
Okay. It's a wonderful story. So, it's important, I swear. Okay, so, do the rich notice things that other people wouldn't? Like,
I would
small
clarify
details.
by saying people notice other things that people wouldn't.
Okay,
I don't
yeah,
think.
people, so I want to be a little more specific though. Let's say certain cultures in general notice things differently.
Yeah.
They focus on different details.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so then the question is, do you think an omnibenevolent God notices our small moral infractions to a much greater extent than we do?
Well, I don't believe in it.
Assume with me
God,
for the problem of evil.
I would say logically, yes, that would be reasonable.
Yes, so if God notices these infractions way more than we do, are we actually worthy of God's blessings from God's perspective? Even little things, do you think that they impact God such that we don't deserve his blessings?
So this is a difficult thing.
I think it's a really difficult thing. That's why I'm making you answer it.
I would say no, because he knows how the game is going to run.
Gotcha. Okay. So, so people are actually worthy of God's blessings, even though because God's foreknowledge should have prepared him.
I mean, I would say no, but that's simply because I don't believe in that.
Okay.
Different conception.
So then assume with me a perfectly moral, holy being.
Okay.
Do you think that they would think us deserving of blessings like saving from earthquakes and pushing us out in front of train, or pushing us away from
absolutely.
trains? Okay.
Yeah. Prevention of needless suffering, absolutely.
So
would be high on the list of a perfect.
Do we deserve it though? Is it deserved by us?
I don't know what you could do to earn the right to exist.
Fantastic
or
answer.
To protect
I
it.
like that quite a bit. So, I don't think that we could even earn the right to exist either. So, if we don't even have a right to exist, I don't think I had a right to exist before I was born. I don't know if I have a right to exist now from God's perspective. So, does God have to actually prevent us from dying? Or is the small time that he gives us an undeserved blessing all by itself?
No. I would say that once you're alive, there is an obligation, if you're in charge of things, to maintain that. That there are no promises about those things which have not happened.
Okay. So if there are no promises for things that have not happened, is God, before God creates and before evil exists, is God obligated by his foreknowledge to prevent evil things?
Yeah.
Do you see the contradiction I'm trying to get you to fall into?
I do not.
Okay, so your first answer is that God's omniscience makes him required to be ready, to know that we're suffering in advance and should prevent such things.
Mm-hmm.
But this answer is that God is not required in advance to prevent the bad things from happening. Or for blessings at the very least.
Yeah, because I don't really understand what you mean when you're talking about blessings, really. But
I just mean any gift from God, I'm going to call a blessing.
Can you rephrase that last question?
Yeah. So, does the omniscience of God require him to create a perfect world, or does the omniscience of God, I've got to phrase this right, does the omniscience of God only apply after we live?
Yeah.
So I guess where is God's obligation? Is it before we exist, or is it after we exist?
So if there was a perfectly all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful God, the obligations would run throughout all possibilities.
Gotcha. Okay. So then we'll choose the first option then. So then the question again is God obligated to give us life eternal? Or is it just a blessing enough that we exist for 26 years? Whatever it is, however old we are.
You know, really having a difficult time answering this because the questions are loaded. But
absolutely. Welcome to cross-examination. I want to corner you.
Let's say no.
Okay.
No, there is no obligation because there is no God.
Okay.
I won't accept that route.
All right. Okay, I'm going to continue on this vein, though.
Okay.
The accusation seems to be that God's goodness requires him to intervene when evil is about to occur. Is this accurate?
there is,
Yeah.
then yes.
Yeah, if there is God,
Then
he would be required to interact before evil is to
or
occur.
prevent the circumstances from occurring in the first place would be a better
Gotcha.
option. I would think.
If God were to actually interact with our world, such as to try to stop someone's free choice from committing evil, would this world actually be better for us?
No.
It wouldn't be better.
No.
So then there is the possibility that God allows certain evils.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the problem of evil.
So if it's fine for God to allow certain problems of evil, then how does that how does evil contradict the existence of God?
I don't say that it's fine for him to.
Okay. So you'd say that it contradicts the goodness of God.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. So, is it bad for me to restrict someone else's autonomy?
Yeah.
Okay. Would it be bad for God to restrict somebody else's autonomy?
Yeah.
Okay, so then God can't restrict our autonomy, even from the beginning.
Aren't there restrictions?
What restrictions?
And we have,
If we're assuming free will for the purposes of the free will defense.
there's a difficulty with that question, but we'll go ahead and say, sure, it would be wrong.
Okay.
But there's a lot in that question that you're putting in there that is problematic.
Okay. I'll go ahead and ask. Go ahead and explain the problematic, so that way you can get your actual position out there.
Well, if the God is all-knowing, creates a system of right and wrong, puts us through it, gives us the ability to do wrong, yet knows the outcome prior to it, and knows that there's going to be evil and suffering, I would say that that is actively creating evil and suffering.
Gotcha. So divine foreknowledge would thus be a determining factor. Wouldn't that rule out the presupposition of free will in the first place?
Not necessarily.
Okay. And I'm out of time.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your. Okay, so we have 30 minutes for Q&A. So if you have questions, write them now. You can write them on your bulletin, tear it out, or just turn in the whole thing, and just send it towards the middle aisle, and a volunteer will grab it. A reminder that our taco truck is open, so if you're hungry and you need tacos or burrito or quesadilla.
Pork quesadillas are to die for.
Yeah, the pork is very good.
Yeah.
Everyone likes the food. So just bring up the questions.
Yeah.
I'll take. And while we collect the questions, I'll take advantage of being the moderator, and I've got a question for each participant. And I think they're kind of yes or no questions, so I think they're relatively simple. But this might be, I don't know. I want to be helpful in kind of summarizing some of what we've heard tonight. So, Evan, I'm going to ask you a question first. As your pastor, is it possible that you might know, because this was a question that Professor Deere was asking you several times, is it possible that you might know what good is through revelation, through the scriptures, for example?
Absolutely. So if God is interacting with the world, it would become quite obvious that what good and wrong, or good and bad was, as he would reveal it. I wanted to stick as philosophically as I could and tried to bring up almost no theology. I think I did okay. I hope I did okay. But yeah, that's why I never brought up the idea of revelation.
Some people think you should bring up theology when it's appropriate. even in a philosophical debate. But I'm just teasing you because I can do that. Okay. Professor Deere, would you say that it is possible, hypothetically, is it possible that greater goods can come about as a result of pain and or suffering? And so you know where I'm going at with this, my answer would be that if it is possible that greater goods can come about as a result of evil and suffering, then that would mean that the coexistence of evil and God is certainly logically possible. But
no.
Okay. So you wouldn't say?
Yeah, I would not say that.
Okay. Okay. Well, those were my two questions.
Can I clarify?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Now, we are extraordinarily limited creatures. We don't live for a long time. Our experiences are limited. We're stuck on basically a single planet. Most of us never get to go to outer space. We only have a certain amount of knowledge and time to gain that. We're not perfect. Therefore, anytime we can be in a circumstance where there is a greater good that comes from suffering, but that's only because of our ignorance and our inability to predict the future and be in a position to take advantage of every opportunity that could be presented to us.
Okay. Okay, well, let's get to your questions. I'll go as fast as I can. Why don't we do 1 minute for an answer and 30 minutes for a rejoinder? Is that okay?
30 minutes?
30 seconds.
Oh,
it's like, we're here a long time. Okay, so 1 minute for the answer to whom the question is addressed and 30-second rejoinder. Okay. So, Evan, we'll just start with you first here. If God cannot prevent evil because he has created free agents, does that mean that our prayers for protection are in vain?
So, no, I don't think our prayers for protection would be in vain. God's interaction doesn't, it doesn't mean God can't interact. It means he's not obligated to. It's that God can do it, and I think he has done it. I'm a Christian. I think that God, in fact, even came into this world and died on a cross for our own, for the salvation of us. But I don't think that he's obligated to do such a thing. I think that's not justice, but it's mercy. And in fact, it's God's mercy that we're asking for in prayers and things like that.
Okay.
No, I have nothing on that.
Okay. As I work through the questions, some of y'all did not circle who the question was for, so tisk tisk, because I want to be fair. Okay, question for, sorry, that's my timer. Okay, question for Professor Deere.
Okay.
God has demonstrated his gracious, compassionate, powerful character through the death and resurrection of his Son. Therefore, why is it inappropriate to answer the problem of evil by having faith in the character of God, that he has truly good reasons for the existence of evil?
Okay. So that would be an evidentially based argument for the existence of God based on scriptures. The problem with scriptures is that there are many, many different ones out there. There are many different religions. It's the conception of a type of God that this debate was supposed to be about tonight. Not one particular God, but a God by any such name that would have the characteristics of being all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. And the compatibility of that with a world in which there is evil and suffering. Not a particular religion itself was my understanding of what we were going to do.
Yeah, so I think I might say that it's not faith in particular that's the philosophical system we're using here, but so the word I used was hope, and that there's a certain kind of hope that I think does help solve the problem of evil. It's that hope that motivates us to love our neighbors, to heal the sick, and to feed the hungry, and things like that. That I think is valid. That I think is even philosophical. I don't even think hope is irrational. I think that you clearly have reasons to have such hope.
Okay, question for Evan. How can the triple O God feel pain? And I wrote in my notes, actually, I believe the word for this is impassibility. right? That God is without passions and so forth. So that's a doctrine that some hold to more than others. So how would you say that the triple O God feels pain?
Okay, so, and you phrased the question philosophically too, so I can't use a cop-out with Jesus became incarnate or something like that. I'm going to have to respond philosophically. The triple O God would then feel pain in the same sense that his goodness is being violated or something to that extent. So it's not that there's pain receptors. I don't think God has a body. I don't think that it wounds him in the same way. I don't think his gut clenches or anything like that. But goodness is being violated, and so God is going to have a similar reeling reaction on a metaphysical level.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to say about that. Again, it's a particular conception that
Okay, Brian, question for you. If morality is relative and determined by the evolution of society, what basis do you have for judging the goodness of God?
Well, again, I wouldn't say that God would be good. It would be a radically different conception of God. Again, I'm on the stance that the problem of evil and the compatibility of the triple O God is indeed a problem. And that's pretty much about it on that.
Okay. Evan?
Can you repeat the question for me? Do you have it on you?
If morality is relative and determined by the evolution of society, what basis do you have for judging the goodness of God?
Gotcha. Yeah, so this is what I try to criticize him for. I think actually he does have a way out of it. That a priori synthetic thing is a Kantian move that actually does make things necessary and experiential simultaneously. I don't actually think that Professor Deere is going to jump into relativism. I think ultimately there's got to be some source if it's necessary. There's got to be something that's there that's making it necessary, and that's where my criticism would come in.
Okay. Evan, question for you. I kind of asked this already. Let me look at this one here. Okay. You said pain points to something that is wrong. So what is wrong that there is pain in the world? If God allows pain to get us to notice something is wrong, what does he want us to notice?
I think he wants us to notice evil. I think that if we didn't have pain, we wouldn't notice evil, that we wouldn't actually want to do anything about it. It wouldn't bother us. So my analogy that I was using is this kid that doesn't have pain receptors, or at least they don't work, and they don't know that they're injuring their own body. I think God has built this into us to let us know that evil exists in the world, and this isn't a good thing, and we should be fighting it.
And I would just say that I don't think that that's a reasonable thing to assert, because there are people in parts of the world that have suffered greatly over natural disasters who have had no access to religion, like especially a triple O conception of any sort. And I just don't think that a perfectly good God would be willing to put those people through that suffering without the potential, at least.
Okay. Question for Brian, Professor Deere. Excuse me. You stated that you believed in an objective morality that you learn about without God through experience and the scientific method. Where in nature did you observe that the scientific method is sufficient to understand morality?
This is a really good question. So, not quite yet, but maybe soon it will be. I'm saying that the signs not the signs are there. The scientific method has functioned fantastically for so many different things. It has led to so many advancements in massive, massive breadth of areas. And I think that maybe if we apply it with the utility principle, and certainly also with some principle-based stances, that we can get to a better form of higher happiness, less suffering. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of experimentation. We may never fully achieve it. but I think it's certainly better than just a list of rules.
So my students went over Mill's naturalistic fallacy, and I didn't call you out on it because so there's other atheistic philosophers, notably Sam Harris, that we talked about before the debate, that really is trying to press towards that. And Peter Railton, who I respect a lot, kind of embraces it and says that, look, I don't care, and that the naturalistic fallacy is just not going to be a fallacy. Ultimately, I would like the only other option right now seems to be a form of non-naturalism. I think ultimately my own virtue ethics might actually also potentially make a naturalistic fallacy. So I'm keen to steer clear from that kind of thing because I might be wrong.
Okay. Question for Evan. Evan got a lot more questions than Professor Deere. So.
He's got a lot more students.
Yeah.
Wait.
Okay.
Yeah.
So suppose there is a heaven. Does one have free will in heaven? If so, then can there be suffering in heaven? If there can be free will and no suffering in heaven, why not on earth?
All right, cool. Like this question. So I presently think there's already suffering in heaven. I think that God is already suffering because of the goodness that's being violated that he's fully aware of. So yes, there can be suffering in heaven. And yes, there can be free will in heaven. But in heaven, I also don't think that we will opt for that. I think God's presence will actually cause us not to do those things, that coercive factor, we just won't choose those things anymore. I also want to note that the Christian faith doesn't end with heaven. There's another step called resurrection. And so yes, I do actually think that's going to happen on earth also, that these things are actually going to fall together in exactly the pieces that you've asked about.
So heaven is a very immoral and unethical place by your standards then. It must being allowed to have free will. Coercion certainly is not a good thing. That's why we don't have it here on earth. But in heaven, coercion is there? That seems very, very contradictory.
Well, it's opted for. I'll give.
All right. So if we die, we don't want to go to heaven? I'm not sure anyway. Okay. Question for Brian. Why do you feel natural disasters or epidemics are evil rather than unfortunate? Because as you said, a human did not cause it.
So I wouldn't say that they're evil necessarily. I don't really like that term. I much prefer the term suffering. Evil has a lot of religious connotation to it, a lot of overtones. But certainly suffering can be had by people through natural disasters and diseases. I mean, malaria alone has killed billions of people throughout history. Yeah, I would say that suffering is the key term there, not evil.
Can you repeat that question one more time for me?
Why do you feel natural disasters or epidemics are evil rather than unfortunate? Because as you said, a human did not cause it.
Yeah. So I was going to bring this up if Professor Deere tried to side with some sort of relativism thing, but he didn't. What standard would we have to judge a natural disaster for being wrong? But he does cling to an objective standard, so I actually can't make that kind of assertion.
Okay. Evan, had a couple of questions in this vein. This is a concise way to say it. So is God not stopping an earthquake in Haiti? Then it is somehow because a Haitian child is rejecting him?
Let me give you two answers. One of them will be yes, and the other one will be no. And so the yes answer, I don't think that any of us are actually innocent. I think that's a myth. I think that that child is going to grow up and be just as evil as you and I. It's in them. They haven't done anything. They're innocent through their actions. They haven't actually done anything to be blamed for. But that malice still lives inside them, and it's there in all of us from birth. The no answer has to do with the fact that the kid hasn't done anything. That's not exactly why God's not there. God's not there for a more metaphysical reason, not because the kid is actually some evil criminal at 3 months old or something weird.
Okay.
Yet the child still dies.
That it does. So let's go help people in Haiti.
That's all I have to say.
Okay, question for Professor Deere, and this may be the last one I have for you, so we might do an equal time thing on questions for Evan in the future or something. Natural disasters are by definition natural. Therefore, if your stance on the nature of God is a view that he is not omnibenevolent due to their existence, have you considered that maybe the natural disaster is a natural requirement for earthly renewal, and that possibly they are neither good or bad, or alternatively, that they are actually good? Could this be the purpose of faith?
I would say no, that would not be the purpose of faith, but certainly they are natural, not caused by humanity, and certainly suffering does come from them. But also nature comes from God, according to this line of thinking, wouldn't it? And wouldn't God be the most natural thing of all if God were to exist? Therefore, just saying that it's a natural disaster does not take away any of the responsibility of the suffering or evil that may come from it. It's still created at some point.
All right, so at the very beginning of your opening remarks, you talked about that there's no bigger plan that we can appeal to. If you didn't say that, I actually was going to use a very similar question. So the bigger plan are God being omniscient and us being not. It's totally possible that God made the world, and presently all those natural disasters were supposed to still happen, but God would have prevented such things if we had not rebelled.
Okay. Question for Evan. Why is an omnipotent God not powerful enough to create a world with free will and no natural, non-man-made evil? Doesn't his inability to do this prove that a triple O God does not exist?
Cool. So I actually thought that, Professor, you're going to use this as a criticism for me. That I think God is constrained within logic might be a all right enough term this time for right now. I don't think that the contradictions are a power. I don't think that God can have a power to do something contradictory. I don't think that that actually increases his power. So I had this in my notes just in case. The question I think is similar, can run on a similar vein. Is God powerful enough to reduce his own power? Which would be another contradiction, which would make, if he could do that, God actually would have a fault. He could make himself less powerful. I don't think that contradictions are actually going to increase God's power in any way, shape, or form. So I can say that God can be constrained by contradictions, and actually he's still at full strength.
Could you read it one more time?
Yes. I think so. Oh, why is an omnipotent God not powerful enough to create a world with free will and no natural, non-man-made evil? Doesn't his inability to do this prove that a triple O God does not exist?
I mean, I would say yes. But also, because I don't find those to be completely incompatible. I don't think that those are logically incompatible requirements. Now, I do think that asking God to do something that is logically incompatible, like standing still while moving faster than the speed of light, is a ridiculous question to ask. And that if we do allow for the God to be unbounded by logic, then that is the fastest conversation of all, because it turns everything that we're discussing into absolute nonsense, and we just ought to stop, because otherwise it's a rocking chair.
Okay. Question for Professor Deere. In John 1:3 and Colossians 1:16, the Bible says that all things were created by God, and without him nothing was created. Therefore God created all evil, pain, and suffering. Could God not think of any way for free will to exist without so much bad in the world? I can think of many, and I make no claim to omniscience. If God chose those things, he must have wanted them in the world, so is he really omnibenevolent? more likely evil exists on its own. I'm not sure if that actually went for you, but anyway.
Yeah.
It's circled for you. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that there's a flaw with the good part of the triple O. Omnibenevolence, I think, would be the weakness at that point. And maybe it's just an ill-conceived aspect of the nature of God, and maybe it ought to be rethought. But that would be my answer to that.
Can you read the third sentence? I think is the actual question.
Therefore, God created all evil, pain, and suffering.
Okay.
Could God not think of any way for free will to exist without so much bad in the world?
My answer is no. That I think it literally is a logical contradiction for God to prevent our free will from doing these things. I think that God has to let us be free if he's made us free, that otherwise we get that contradiction. The other point that I had was that I don't think God created evil in particular. I think what evil is a twisting of the good. So I don't think that food is bad, but if you throw a tomato at a 5-year-old, I'm going to criticize you for it. So it's the twisting of good things, using them what they're not meant for, that I think is actually bad.
Okay, I'm going to take this question and I'm going to twist it a little, change it a little for you, Professor Deere.
Okay.
There's a few questions. Are you saying that God doesn't exist because he allows evil?
That particular conception, yes.
Okay. Is it possible that God does exist, but he is evil, and that is why he allows evil?
I mean, not completely evil, because then you would run into the exact same problems that we're running into with the omnibenevolent God. But somewhere in between, sure.
Okay.
That would be.
Evan, there actually is a debate. I can't remember the philosopher. He's a British philosopher, but he actually posited that would be a solution to the problem of evil, would just be to say that instead of thinking of God as good, think of God as evil, and you solve the problem. But Evan, do you think it's possible that God allows evil because God himself is evil?
Sure, but that wouldn't be the triple O God, and so our problem of evil discussion was surrounded with all 3 O's, and I'm still trying to defend all 3 O's. I think that, yeah, that would be a very easy way to get out of the problem of evil. I just don't think that it's a very good way, do you get the pun, way out of the problem of evil.
Okay, maybe we'll make this, I think, the last question, because I think, maybe, let's see. Okay, question for Evan, for Professor Frisk. If you mention that God does not prevent natural disasters because of our lack of connection to God and our practice of sin, how would you justify a natural disaster affecting individuals who have a strong connection to their religion and their God?
So I think that even if we have a strong connection, we still do not deserve those kinds of blessings. That the strong connection, I think, this is in the theology now, that God is going to provide for those strong connections later. That it's just not time for the kingdom to come. So for now, we have to be content with the fact that God is going to see us as very evil creatures, that even our smallest sins are going to look huge to him. So that even the people with great connections still have huge sins sitting on them from God's perspective. And that while God is going to reward us later for those kinds of connections with him, I don't think ultimately those rewards come now.
And 2 things. One is the gradation of all the different sins being very large in the eyes of God. I think that's not a wise thing to do. I just don't think that's a wise thing to do, to equate all bad things as being so supremely bad. It just allows for too many justified problems, but that's not really the point of it. So I don't really understand what you mean by we may not deserve the blessings, just to be perfectly honest with you. But I would also say that we don't deserve the suffering. I don't see how that would be deserved.
Okay. One more question for Brian, and I might sneak one more in. You say that if there is a God, then why does he allow evil or pain? So then how could you not say that there is a devil that is not allowing good to prevail?
Well, it's an interesting question. It's a very theological question, and the problem with that is that if God is the creator of all, then God would still have to be there to create the devil as well, and that would be, that's a theological question. I'm not really well suited to answer that one. I think that Evan would be much better.
Why don't you take the last word?
So, actually, I'm going to agree with Brian again. I think that if Satan can overpower God, then God's not all-powerful, and we actually have another problem. We can't defend the triple O God anymore. Yeah, I think that God created Satan. I think that Satan has free will also. I think he's nice and subtle so that we don't notice things. But ultimately, God does have sovereignty and power even over Satan.
Okay, well, we have to stop somewhere, so we're going to stop there. I want to thank you all for coming out again. This is a great crowd, so thank you very much. Thanks to our speakers who modeled what civil discourse ought to look like, and maybe what debates ought to look like. Please stay. There's tacos at the food truck, and there's cookies and punch and so forth next door. So thanks again for coming, and stick around.